Greetings, fellow illustrators. It is week 12, and this is our final day of the week. And I'm going to start with just going over our schedule so you make sure you know kind of where you're at. So we're going to head over to our schedule here. We are at right here, 4/2 on Thursday, April 2nd. We're going to talk about Project 6 in terms of how to start. We're going to take a look at the rightmost set right here. So I'll break that out in pieces, and then we're going to take a look at a demonstration, really just getting your file set up once you have collected your images, once you have created your concept illustration. I'm going to talk about how to capture that effectively based on the type of lighting you'll need if you're drawing that out on paper. And then, of course, to conclude, we're going to look at how to begin your block out for your digital portrait painting. All right, so we're at week 12. Let's go ahead and move on. If you haven't, please take a look at Project 6. You're going to be reading quite a bit. That's okay, that's expected. Let me just show you where all of our files are at. Okay, so I'm in Google Drive right now. Here we are, week 12, day 2. I'm looking at this PDF here, Project 6, and then I'm going to introduce these other PDFs here. So we're going to likely take a look at this one here. It says Concept Illustration. We're also going to take a look at this PDF here. It says Guideline, Blockout, Shade, and Highlights. And then, of course, I'm going to open up this file here. It's a Photoshop file. It says Seymour Hoffman, and then I'm going to be using this brush set called Character Brushes. So this file right here is very important because we're going to be using it for the duration of this project. You'll see a folder here called Extra Brushes. I might go over that a little bit. Really, it's self-explanatory. Once you learn how to load our main character brushes, you can learn how to use extra brushes as well. Okay, so let me go back to our PDFs, and then I'll kind of walk through that. For Project 6, by now you should have chosen which celebrity you're going to choose for this project. And I kind of go over that here on page 2, Project Specs. Talks about the project itself. I have a little tip down below, and in the warning area, please get familiar with those two things because they are beneficial with your success of this project. And then, of course, we have project requirements. So by now, you should have a very good idea who you're going to execute for this project. Just be very careful of which option to choose from, as addressed in my email. Earlier this week, I mentioned there's no shame in choosing the beginner level, the character as is. Even though that's a beginner level, it is based on time. The higher the option number, the more advanced, the more time it takes to execute that in regard to a high quality outcome. All right, so let's start. This is Project 6 right here. I'm going to move on now to our first step of our project, and that is creating a concept illustration. So go ahead, please read carefully. I'm going to talk about these steps in this PDF. The first step of our project, of course, is to get our choice of character illustrated. Simple as that. But before you even start there, you're going to need some high quality reference images. So the concept that I'm going to portray in this lesson is based on, let me go back to our Project 6 PDF. It's based on, there it is. It's based on real character portrayed as fictional character, option 3. The reason I am demonstrating this option is I'm basically aiming at the high bar. So for those of you that happen to choose an advanced option, let me tell you how involved that can get. I will be careful with my words because I am looking at the clock. So let's go back over to the browser here. We're going to do an image search for, let me go back to our option, real character portrayed as fictional character. Okay. Oops, pardon me. You could also say real character portrayed as imagined character, or real character portrayed as another real character. You can see that I have options 2, 3, and 4. All right, so here is kind of how I'm going to start with that. So my concept is a little more advanced, and I'm suggesting be very careful about which option you choose. All right, so in this example that you're seeing here on screen, we have the concept of Philip Seymour Hoffman portrayed as Mark Twain. To go about creating that merger of two characters, okay, I'm first going to take a look at all of my image options for Mark Twain. In doing so, you can see we have quite a few options to choose from. What I'm really wanting to look for is contrast. Okay, so you have to be very mindful about the choices you make when you are in your image reference search. The other aspect I'm looking for right now is the perspective or angle at which Twain here is facing. The reason I'm stressing these two aspects are because if I'm going to merge one character as another, I have to have a really clear set of images to choose from that pair extremely well. So I'll do my best to kind of demonstrate that here in another file that I have in Photoshop. Right now I'm just showing you that in your Google search for images, yes, you can choose the tools option at the top. If you're not familiar with that, let's go over that very quickly. Under usage rights here, if I said not filtered by license, I'm going to get everything to show up. If I kind of trim or filter that down, labeled for non-commercial use or labeled for reuse, I get a less amount of options. Okay. I can also search for a large image size rather than a very, very small size. So that's going to help filter down which images I can use and which images I may want to use. Let me show an example of contrast. I'm going to head over here and we're going to take a look at images of Philip Seymour Hoffman. If I'm looking at this range that we're seeing right now, you can tell that in terms of contrast, we have quite a few different options here. If I look at an image with low amount of contrast, I'm going to select this one here from the Telegraph, right there. Okay. When I search an image, I do have to go to its original source, so I'm going to do that over here. Click on the hyperlink, it's going to take me to that page. Now in this example, the image is already under copyright and you can see the credits are listed down below. When we're really looking at right now though is contrast. If you take a look at the amount of light that reaches or hits Hoffman's face, it's very low in terms of its intensity. Where it gets pretty complex, if you can imagine having to paint the shadow around the eye, okay, that's a lot of detail that I may or may not want to pursue. So when you're looking at your photo references, think about how you would execute that by hand. That's what I'm really having you study right now. The less amount of shadows, the less amount of time it's going to take for me to execute my portrait. Okay, because the way in which we're going to approach it is really based on midtones, highlights, and shadows. And we're going to start that in a grayscale. And I'm going to show you how to do that here in a little bit. So right now, if I'm studying this image, I can see, okay, I have quite a few highlights here above the head. But really, overall, I don't have a lot of really harsh shadows. I have a lot of detail where the beard is and a lot of shadow along the eye. So it's feasible in terms of time commitment, because I know if I'm painting this, if you can imagine painting this in grayscale, I'm really studying the values right now. So contrast is a big part of that. If I go and take a look at some of the options for Twain here, okay, let me set this option back to not filtered. Let's take a look at an example of a photo that is really high in contrast. Okay, there's one here I'm going to take a look at, the official site of Mark Twain, it looks like. Okay, there's a big image. Of course, that's great. We want to choose large images in this example, but It's on a slideshow. Let me go back. There it is. If I just study that one image, okay, let me zoom in so we can kind of see that up close. You can see that it has a lot of very harsh shadows, especially along the eye. Now, if you're having to think of how to paint that, you're talking about a very, very intense amount of time, dedication. When you bring in high contrast, now you have to determine how the little details there are affected by that. And then you have to worry about the transition over to the very bright, intense portion of the face. So even though it's a great photo, it's clear, it's wide open, and I like the perspective in which it is angled at. The contrast is not the best choice. So when you do your image search, be very sensitive to those two things: perspective and the amount of contrast. Okay, that's it. Let me go back to our PDF. Okay, let's take a look at that. So what am I looking at? I'm looking at the concept illustration. You'll see that in step A here, it says find and collect at least 10 to 15 reference images in relation to your project. The reason I say that is because if you are choosing a project option that's a little more advanced, you're going to want to choose 2 images here that pair pretty well together. Let me show an example of what I mean by that. So if I'm at this point, I've collected, let's say, 15 to 30 images, and I want to see which 2 images I can take of 2 people to merge them as one. Let's see how that looks. Okay, so I'm back in Photoshop. I'm going to come back to this file too. I'm just going to talk about this one thing, and that is my reference images for this illustration that I created. Okay, so here's that photo of Mark Twain. I decided that I'm going to use it, and I'm going to use it to merge with Philip Seymour Hoffman. But you'll notice that the photo of Hoffman, let me show you that, is very similar in regard to intensity of light and contrast. So what I mean by that is that if you take a look at Hoffman's glasses here, you see that harsh shadow, you see the angle at which he was photographed, and then you compare that with Mark Twain here, and you see it's almost identical. So I wanted to do that. It's very strategic because now I can focus on how these 2 images are going to pair or merge together. When they're lined up like this and they have the same amount of intensity of light, it's easier for me to determine how to illustrate that. Okay, so I'm going to turn these reference images off. Here is the attempted merger of Hoffman as Twain. I'm going to kind of explain that here in just a little bit, but first of all, let me go back to our PDF. For your concept illustration, what I'm asking you to do is, yes, go ahead and do draw that on paper. If you prefer, or if you're enabled to do that on screen, then by all means, you could do that digitally. I just do not expect us to have that option right now. So if you are drawing, and when you are drawing this on paper, what I'm asking you to do is, yes, do a refined illustration. Don't do a sketch. The reason this is an important part of the process is we need those hard edges in the file to help serve as a guideline when we paint. And sometimes those lines are critical when differentiating shadow versus highlight. So do your best to draw with a high quality here with your concept illustration. I'm going to come back to that, don't worry. Let's see. Okay, yes, lighting. Lighting is a big part of this. If you're capturing your illustration with your phone, okay, you can probably use my overview for online learning from week 11 to help kind of guide you in terms of how to set that up. So I'm not going to dwell on this too much, but I did want to bring that about so you have a good idea of how to do that. In order to capture a photo, thankfully we're in the spring. The sun outside is pretty intense. Natural light is your best choice of where to set up your illustration. So what I'm suggesting is find a window that has natural light. Kind of experiment and see if you need to filter that light with a sheet or a curtain. If you're getting too much light intensity on your illustration and you're trying to capture that with your phone, obviously you can have a shadow get in the way. So setup is important. Natural light's the best because you don't have to worry about color cast on that image when you capture it with your phone camera. Once you get that image into your phone, you can go ahead and email yourself that image, and then you can bring it in either into Adobe Photoshop or GIMP. And that's kind of where I'm at with this right here. Okay, so I have, let's say, I did cut out quite a few steps in that process, but here is my original, this is just with pencil. You can see I'm using bold outlines with a very fine detail in the hair. What I would suggest, however, is with your illustration, if you're not very confident in drawing in the first place, yes, it is okay to trace some portions of your character or your character in full if you absolutely need to. The reason I say that is because this isn't done. This is just the first step. We just want to get the integrity of our character lines set so that we have a blueprint to kind of paint with. When we're painting, eventually, we're going to be painting over these lines. We're going to be painting underneath them. So they are kind of like the framework of the face. Don't worry too much about detail, especially in the face. You can see that I have some very faint lines in the neck. I may paint right over those and in the eyes. I did, however, decide to draw the glasses as accurately as possible. And I went with a more contemporary approach for that to kind of match Hoffman as best as possible. So let me show you this process here of drawing, because this was not just the only version I had. I had the opportunity to scan this, and that's what you're seeing right here. And I just decided, well, what would it look like if, let's say, Hoffman had Twain's original nose? And you can see that, oh my gosh, that's a drastic change from what I had originally here with Hoffman's real nose. And again, I'm bringing my reference images into Photoshop to kind of look and match and get an idea here. And then I go back to paper and then I redo just a small portion of that face. So you can see what I mean. I don't have to redraw everything. In this case, I just have to focus on the nose. I'm experimenting. The jawline as well. I wanted to see what it's like if I changed that. And to do that by hand was much faster for me. I brought that back into Photoshop, and you can see that I'm doing that just to kind of compare the two. I went ahead and decided to do a third, and that is what happens if I brought Hoffman's mouth in instead of Mark Twain's. And you can see the difference there. I ultimately decided to go with Twain's lip and mustache versus Hoffman's lip with Twain's mustache. So that does get a little confusing. The reason is identity. I wanted to portray Hoffman as Twain as much as possible while keeping Philip Seymour Hoffman's identity intact. So again, if you're choosing this type of option, there's a lot to it. Please be careful about which selection you make. At this point of the concept illustration, now I am in Photoshop here, and what I did is I added some adjustment layers down below. Let me zoom in so you can see that. Okay, here are those options for adjustment layers. The only reason that I wanted to bring this attention to you is because the contrast of my pencil, the way it was scanned, is not very intense, and I wanted to make that darker. So to do that, I'm just adding a simple adjustment layer. You can see the two that I've chosen up here: brightness and contrast, and black and white. So those are really easy to add. You just select them from that list in layers right there. Okay. So that's what I'm showing you right now. If I turn those on, those are in their own folder or group. Okay, you can do that up here in layers. You can say new group or new group from layers, and you can collect those. So you can see that right away, I'm getting very organized in my file. And every time I do this type of change, I want to say file save. Okay, so just get in the habit of saving often. But you can see the difference here. If I added by adding a few adjustment layers, okay, the contrast is much sharper, it's higher. I can turn those adjustment layers off if I really need to. Okay, so that's kind of a luxury. Right now, I wanted to set it to black and white because the scan I originally had a little bit of a tint of blue and magenta in there. So by setting a black and white adjustment layer, I take all of that information, color information out. So that's really important. So yes, you want a black and white image just like this. That's your first step in Project 6. Let me just go back to our PDF because I'm going to slow down a little bit. We're going to get set up for this next portion of Project 6, and that is something we call blocking out your character. Okay, I can close this. All right, so let's go back. Our concept illustration is your first step. Okay, getting that down on paper, getting it in, capturing it with your phone, and then getting that back into Photoshop, just as I showed you. That'll take a little bit of time. Spend some quality time on that illustration. You should only be able to do it once, and that's all. When you are finished with that, now we're ready to move on to Project 6 and blocking out. Okay, blocking out, this is how we're going to approach our project. Okay, so let me break this down. Now, I expect you to be reading all of this, so I'm not going to regurgitate what you see here on screen, but I am going to talk about context. Okay, so eventually, this is what we're going to be doing. When we're talking about these two images here, you can see on the right-hand side, I've created this for you. I'm going to introduce this eventually, but for right now, today, we may not even need it. That is a light reference. That is a three-dimensional ball that you can think of when you compare it to the human skull. If you look at the human skull here on the left-hand side, you can see that it too is just a sphere, and on the sides, they have been lobbed off. So if you're imagining the light that comes in and hits at the side of that skull, that's how you can use this 3D ball reference for your own character to see where the highlights hit, where the backlight hits, and where the shadows hit. And then also kind of get an idea about your midtones as well. So that's why I wanted to talk about that right now. Blocking out though, let me kind of talk about that. On the next page here, I kind of explain your light source. Okay, where exactly is your light source in your project? Is it going to be from the very top? Is it going to be from the side, or is it going to be from the bottom? This particular example demonstrates the difference in highlights, shadows, and midtones. So when I talk about blocking out, with our Project 6, we're not going to dive into color. And as a matter of fact, you don't want to do that if you've never done digital painting before. The reason is you're going to focus too much on color, and then things will get really muddy and kind of mixed improperly, and you're not focusing on the key thing, and that is the value scale that you've learned in, let's say, two-dimensional art. So we are going to start by painting in grayscale. Okay, so here's the three reasons why. It forces us to, again, focus on value, not have to worry about the temperature of the skin or the environment. Okay, since we are painting in representational style, your brain is going to be better suited or trained to just focus on the value first, and then later we're going to add color on top of that grayscale. It'll be a lot easier and faster at that point in the process. Okay, so blocking out. This is kind of the next page here. This is the PDF of guidelines of blocking out. I show you step by step how to block out, and I'm going to show you now in Photoshop of that same illustration I showed you how to do that based on techniques. So please read this page. Basically, all you're doing is you're creating a few layers. You're going to be blocking out the hair and the skin, and that's it. Okay. Yeah, I do mention that at the time of grading, I will need to see your grayscale layers. So please keep those in your file and make sure you save them at the very end too. This example here is an illustration from Bram Sells, and he shows you what blocking out will eventually look like. Okay, so you can see in this example what I've done is I've given you some tips in Photoshop of how to set your brush, what size, what opacity. Okay, the example here is in reference to using that three-dimensional ball. Okay, so don't worry about the ball yet. I will introduce that a little later. Right now, this is an example of what I mean by blocking out. You can see the highlights have been painted, some of the shadows, and some of the midtones. Really, though, what you're focused on is shapes. Okay, shapes of the face. Okay, kind of like what we did with our character series when we talked about shapes. You're doing really the same thing here, but for the human face. So, like you can imagine here, this eyebrow is one big kind of weird rounded shape. Okay, you have the nose here, has kind of a more rigid shape toward the tip of it. And then, of course, you have cheeks that have a little bit more flatness or roundness to them. Again, we're talking about shapes. So painting, blocking out those shapes. Let me show you an example of what I mean just to get started for Project 6. Okay, so I'm looking at the clock. We have about 5 minutes left. Back to our Philip Seymour Hoffman as Mark Twain. And okay, right now I just have my illustration and some adjustment layers. The next thing that I decided to do, though, is determine my light source. Okay, and there is that ball that I talked about. There's the ball I was referring to, or the sphere. That sphere is really just kind of telling me, okay, my light is going to be coming in from the very far right side. The reason I decided to do that is because of my reference images. If we take a look at those again, the light is coming in from the right hand side. So if I'm painting in representational style, I'm not trying to get cute or tricky or anything. I just want to go based off of what those reference images are telling me. Okay, so that is how I made my decision of my light source. To begin blocking out, I'll go ahead and turn that layer off. Let me turn on the blockout layer. And this is kind of a very rough way to start blocking out. But again, blocking out is not the detail. It's going to be a little painful at first because if you love detail, don't worry about that right now. You're going to want to focus on the shapes, okay? The basic shapes. All right, so let's take a look. I have one layer here, and what I've done is I'll just simulate this one more time. Okay, so let me turn it off. I am going to sample this gray here. But basically what I did is I created a new empty layer over in the layers, and I just dumped in gray paint. Okay, just like that. Now it's a little dark, but you can see what I mean. My illustration is at the very top of my layers. Okay, so the way I did that was, let's go back to that illustration. What I would want to do here, let me zoom in, is in layers, I want to set my illustration layer as multiply. Okay. The reason I want to do that is because when I'm blocking out down below that illustration, the illustration should always be on top of whatever grayscale color I'm using to block out the illustration. The next thing I did in this blockout layer, is you can see based on the examples of your own file that I provided you, is I added a mask. Okay, so let me do that. To add a mask, you go down below in layers and you look for that little camera-like looking icon and you just click it once. And right now you're in masking mode. To mask, you're going to want to use just a basic brush. Okay, so let me do that right now. Pick a brush over here. And I have a brush set at about 41 pixels. Let me bring that up to about 80 there, or maybe even larger. Okay, and hardness is somewhat hard on the edge. I don't really know if I want to get too harsh on the edge, so balance your hardness maybe 25%. Okay, your opacity at the very top, that's fine. When you're blocking out right now, or when you're masking, you don't need to worry about it too much. When I'm masking, there are a few things I want to keep an eye on. My foreground and background colors over here in Photoshop. So when I'm masking and I'm painting in white, that's going to retain the image. When I flip it and I paint in black, that's going to actually mask the layer out for us. So I'll show you what I mean by that. Well, the other thing that I keep an eye on is the mask thumbnail over here as well. Make sure you have that selected and not painting in the layer itself. Okay, that's a really important technique. Make sure you always select the thumbnail. Now I'm ready to mask. So when I'm masking, I am going to take advantage of the zoom feature. I'm going to hold down the space bar, and that's going to allow me to move around the image. Okay, and then now I'm going to mask out that gray. Okay, so I'm going to change my size of my brush and the hardness. I just needed to test. There's a very harsh edge. You can see that's not great either because you get a really blotchy edge that's circular in some spots. So you want to get a semi-hard, semi-soft edge there when you're masking out. Why am I masking out? Well, okay, great question. I'm not going to mask this whole thing. It would take me too long right now to do that. Just showing you how to mask if you have never done that or maybe you forgot. All right, so here's the result of how I painted and masked out this layer. You can see a better example of the mask here if you turn on the second block out, and that is of the face. You can see that my mask over here is representing the actual masking of this. So what I did in this layer is I created a new layer with a different grayscale for the tone of the skin, okay? So one way to determine which type of gray to use is go back to your reference images. In my case, I had an image that was black and white, so I had a slight advantage. If I needed to set both images as black and white to get a true idea or depiction of where my mid-tone gray hits, okay, I can use, again, an adjustment layer to do that. So I'm going to go to adjustment layers here. And what I'm going to do is choose the black and white adjustment layer. Okay. When I do that, what happens is it applies to every layer below that. So that's not exactly ideal because all I need to do in my layers right now to show you this is I need to basically append that adjustment layer to the Seymour Hoffman layer. It's really easy. All you need to do is hover over the line in between those two layers. Okay. Hold down Option. You're going to see this little arrow. Your cursor turns to an arrow with a box. That means you're going to clip this adjustment layer to that one layer right there. Okay, so just like that. All that means is that the color image of Philip Seymour now is in black and white. That's great because what I can use is the eyedropper tool to select a mid-tone value here in the face. So I'm kind of looking at the photo right now. I'm going, okay, where is a good place to select mid-tone? Well, generally you want to select somewhere that's fleshy, but that's not too bright. So I like to choose right in the cheek somewhere where it's not too dark and not too bright, somewhere where it's going to be neutral gray. Okay, and you can see that my gray shows up here in the foreground color. Okay, to test for midtones, okay, I can try that again on Twain here. I can see, again, too bright of a cheek, too dark of a cheek. I want somewhere in the middle, so I'm going to select my block out midtone for my flesh gray right there. Okay, so it's very similar to what I had when I chose a gray from Hoffman. All right, so this, what you're seeing here is basically just the start of blocking out. I created a new layer once again, so now I should have 2 layers, and then I'm going to do the same technique. I'm using the paint bucket tool. Okay, that's over here in the tools right in the middle. Sometimes you'll just see the gradient tool blocking it. You may need to click, hold, and select paint bucket. Okay, so that's one way to do it, is if I have a new empty layer, I'm just going to boop, paint it just like that. And I'm going to show you one last trick, okay? And this is where masking is really, really helpful. Let me zoom in. So this is how we're going to conclude for today. When I spent a lot of time on this mask and I got everything kind of masked out, what I can do is I can reuse that mask. So if I hold down the Option key, I can click, hold, and drag that mask into any other layer. Okay, and Photoshop will ask me, do you want to replace the layer mask? And I'll go ahead and say yes. And you can see what happened. When I replace a mask, I don't have to put in as much work now. I can just reuse that mask and add to it. Okay, so that's going to save you a lot of time in your process when you're blocking out. So yeah, you're going to want to spend some time masking. That's all I'm suggesting. Turn those off. Okay, so in the end, I have something like this. Now I have an extra layer here, and I'm going to stop here in a second. The extra layer I have here is just to show you how I started It's not final, but started with some shading because I was really kind of curious about the details. So I went ahead and just added that layer and kept it in there. The reason I don't like this layer personally is because it's way too fuzzy and muddy right now. So even though that's an experiment, it really serves as kind of demonstrating how you could start with some of the shadows when you are considering your final block out. Okay, so blocking out, how long are we going to be doing this? Let's take a look back at that schedule. Again, this PDF here, Block Out, Shade, and Highlights, is really getting you set up for the very first phase of Project 6. If you go back to our schedule, you can see that we're going to continue to block out all of next week. It's a very important part of the process. No, it's not quite exciting, but if you can get kind of motivated and painting the shapes of the face and just working in grayscale, you're going to be in great shape when we get to color. Okay. By week 14, you can see that we're going to be doing something called a refine block out. Okay, so blocking out is a big part of this process. Ultimately, in the end, we're going to be going from the block out and then experimenting with color, sitting on top of the gray. Okay, don't worry about that. We'll get to it by week 15. Okay, once again, week 12, April 2nd, Thursday. If you do have any questions or you do want some feedback or need to check in, just make sure to give me a heads up about Zoom, and I will see you next week. Have fun and good luck with your Project 6.